All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of 1000 Ways to Lead. I'm the host for this episode, Reed Chauvin, and I'm joined by Reed Dacey and Jacob Stracely. And in today's episode, I interviewed Joe Polero. He graduated from Owen in the mid-2000s, began his career outside of Owen in investment banking at JP Morgan. After about 8 years of investment banking, he went on to work in investor relations at Wix, did 10 years at Wix before recently transitioning to work as the VP of real estate and workplace at Pinterest. They're quite an interesting career trajectory and in a very different role that he finds himself in now compared to where he started right outside of Owen.
Yeah, I mean, I love Pinterest. I used to use it all the time for like your storyboarding, like when you graduated college and you moved into your first apartment, like your first job, like what you wanted to bring. To me, Pinterest and maybe like the mission and the values of Pinterest feels different than maybe mission and values that would happen at JP Morgan. So I'm really interested to hear about his trajectory, but it reminds me of having transferable skills. And maybe that is the skill set he's found to allow him to make those kind of transitions for companies that feel very, very different from one another.
Yeah. And I mean, regarding the subject matter expertise, all those companies, while different, are similar technology companies, right? Besides JP Morgan, but even at JP Morgan, he was leading TMT for JP Morgan. To me, it seems like just diving deep on some of those interests and then going broad, those transferable skills, being able to use those with a very specific mindset or grasp of a situation, I think is pretty important.
Yeah, I mean, I think remaining within the technology sector has certainly been a contributing factor into Joe's ability to continue to grow in his various roles. And we did talk a lot about transferable skills. One in particular was storytelling, the art of telling a story, crafting a story based on your audience. And it was really interesting hearing how that has shifted in each of those roles. Being an individual contributor at JP Morgan and his audience was the clients, the companies that they were working with. Whereas at Wix, he was in investor relations, the audience was investors. Mm-hmm. And so now at Pinterest, he's got a team of 52 individuals and, he's got a boss, the CFO, and both those groups are his audience. Mm-hmm. So it's a little bit different trying to tell a story to your 52 direct reports across real estate and workplace than it is to try to tell a story to investors. So just having to shift how he approaches that and how he effectively gets work done to be objectives now via a team of 52 versus having direct control over that work was really, really interesting. And Joe had a lot of great insights in that regard.
Yeah.
Cool. I'm going to I can't wait for y'all to hear it. So with that, let's get into it. All right. So Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. Do you mind just quickly introducing yourself and telling us a bit about what you've been up to lately? And do you mind even telling us when you graduated from Owen?
Yeah, sure. Good to chat with you. So I'm originally from Indiana, went to IU for undergrad, studied finance there, worked for a few years, and then went to school at Owen. I was there from 2004 till 2006. Graduated, went to work at JP Morgan in investment banking in San Francisco. Was there for a while, made another stop at a company called Wix, and then actually just recently joined Pinterest earlier this year. So pretty new role for me still, about 8 months in. At Pinterest, I'm running the real estate and workplace teams globally, which really means that the teams that oversee all of our real estate portfolio, our offices, all the facilities, the services within our offices, employee amenities, security, events, things like that. So, and still living in San Francisco.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, cool. Well, appreciate you giving the background on what you've been up to since Owen. I mean, sounds like some really interesting and very different roles that you've experienced from investment banking to now covering the real estate at Pinterest and with the Wix stop in between. So I do kind of want to dig into each of those roles and ideally get a better understanding of what that role entailed and especially like what leadership looked like in each of those roles. Because as I understand it, it looked a little bit different from role to role. But I'm sure you've covered like there's some things from throughout each of those jobs that's built upon, the opportunities that you're experiencing at Pinterest now. So let's start with the investment banking at JP Morgan. Do you mind just talking a little bit about that? You spent 8 years there, if I understand correctly. So like, what did that role entail exactly? What was your coverage and what did leadership look like while you were there?
So, I started as an intern. I interned between my first and second year, and I was in the tech group in San Francisco. My first ever exposure to investment banking. I would say that a lot of the stories and things that you hear about investment banking are fairly true. A lot of work, very late nights, weekends, especially as an intern. You're basically there to work for 10 weeks and do nothing else, but learn a ton. You just learn so much about how the things that you're being taught in school really apply in real life. And sometimes that's very different from what you might learn out of a textbook, but you just really get exposed to a ton of new material and new things that make it very rewarding. So went back full time, and my first few years I covered really broadly all of tech. Worked in software, worked in semiconductors, worked with, hardware companies, internet companies. And after about 3 years there, I then moved into the internet and digital media group, specializing only in those types of companies, and really got exposed to the tech industry. This was 2011, 2010. This was like post-recession, where the tech boom was really kind of beginning, that we all know about and kind of talk about now. High growth companies from all over the world. Like I said, you continue to learn a lot, continue to work a ton. But I think the way that leadership really kind of showed up for me there was, and the way that it really kind of like exposed itself was really through leading by example. I think as you're an early associate, you're going to be working with analysts who are, junior to you, super smart people, also hardworking, but you're really working together. It's more work than people can handle, and you're working very long hours. And I think that like your leadership there comes from being the example of what good work looks like, what your expectation as the associate or the VP or, the more senior banker, what you are telling and showing the team what a good product looks like, what the good conclusion looks like, what the story should look like, because we're going to be presenting this to, either a senior team or a client. So I think really leading by example is incredibly important in those first few years. I'd say the other thing that's really very important is thought leadership, leading with your thoughts, leading with your opinions. And this becomes much later in, I think, your time in investment banking, but really clients want to know what you think. They want to hear what you have to say, and making sure that you have some thoughts, have some maybe unique thoughts, and aren't afraid to share them is a really important leadership as an advisor that you really kind of learn, and that I learned certainly in investment banking. So those are the areas that I think really kind of like were exposed to me as leadership in that role.
So learning how to cultivate a perspective and share that perspective, and then learning how to lead by example, but also craft a story, right? And that's kind of something that you'd mentioned a little bit, is telling a story. You're pitching to a client. You mind just talking a little bit about that and how that's a skill that maybe, you started, out of school at Owen with a baseline understanding, but how the 8 years in investment banking built that skill out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a lot of friends on the buy side, and I think like whenever you're looking at buying a stock, you think about like, what is the story that I'm being told about the stock? Well, on the company or on the sell side, the banking side, like you're the one actually helping craft that story, and your expertise comes from the standpoint of, should be knowing what resonates with the buy side, right? And so that's where the value comes in telling the story as an advisor at an investment bank. And so being able to like craft that story is incredibly important, because again, this is like what's going to be told to the people buying stock or voting for a merger or buying bonds. And so really having like a very formulaic but also concise way that you can tell that story, because you don't have endless amounts of time either to tell the story. So it needs to be something that is very thoughtful, unique, and concise, so that you can get the story and the message across in a very quick period of time, in a short period of time. And I learned it in banking through mentors that I had, through trying to tell stories and not doing such a good job and failing, and also hearing other people and their stories. And that's I think a function that I hadn't appreciated. When you go into investment banking, you think, well, you're just working in models all day long, and you're, just pushing out numbers. And that's certainly part of it in the early start. But I think the real value comes in that storytelling part.
Absolutely. I completely agree, Joe. So let's transition a little bit into Wix. So why don't you start with like, how did that opportunity come about for you, and what exactly did that entail? And maybe how was that a little bit different than what you were doing with JD Morgan?
Yeah, so I met Wix in 2012, company based in Israel. At the time, they were a very small company, less than 400 people, growing incredibly fast. And really, they were disrupting website building. And if you think about what website building was like in 2012, it looks nothing like it is today, mainly because of companies like Wix and because of Wix in many ways. And so they were really kind of one of these first cloud-based software providers for like small businesses and medium-sized businesses and people specifically around building websites. So exciting company. And I think it was around this time when I started to feel like I was advising a lot of these high growth, exciting companies, and I wanted to be a part of them. I didn't just want to be kind of like on the advisory side and then moving on. I wanted to actually be in the room with the executives of the company, like on an ongoing basis and building. So I decided to leave JP Morgan, and we took the company public in 2013. And then I shortly after that left to basically lead investor relations at Wix. And this is where, again, storytelling is so critical. Really what investor relations is I think it should be kind of renamed investor education. You're really just telling the street and investors the story of your company. And that story should endure for many, many years. And there's chapters to that story kind of along the way through earnings reports, through product announcements, through maybe acquisitions that you're telling about. And so that's a very different role than being in the advisory role where you're just kind of telling a story for that moment and not really kind of like building on it over many years or even longer. And so I think that building part is really where leadership takes another role. Leadership takes a much more longer term role in building the story, building, in this case, a new function in a new public company, building new behaviors, building a team. And all of that is just a very different style of leadership than what I experienced in investment banking.
No, I love that you carried the thread through of telling the story from almost an outside in perspective as an advisor to actually like being inside the company and telling that story at a much more in-depth level. I've heard something in the past about how sometimes it's harder to explain things the more you know about them because you consider so many different things. Did you find that to be a challenge in telling the Wix story? It's like, okay, telling the Wix story while at JP Morgan, I know X amount of information, but that information grew exponentially, when you joined Wix. Did you find that to be difficult to kind of wrap your arms around?
Yeah, but that's the challenge of the job. And that's absolutely where, as the CFO, as the head of investor relations, as the CEO, this is a key part of like, you have to get over that challenge. That is something you have to understand. And by the way, like you're going to learn, and we learned this at Wix, like there were some things that we were talking about really in our first year as a public company that was not resonating. It was clear we had cool slides and we had a script. We were talking about it in a consistent way, but it wasn't resonating. And I remember a time I was at an investor conference with our CFO and our president, and we had been going through meetings and it felt like we were just having to answer these same questions over and over again. And we decided we are not telling this story right. It's clearly something is not clicking. And so we need to kind of like go back to square one and rewrite how we're telling a story. And that's what we did. And it worked. If you look at the Wix stock chart from like 2014, the stock kind of went nowhere. And suddenly there was an inflection in 2015. And that's really when that storytelling changed for us. So I think that is a key part of like understanding, too much, you're getting in the details too much. You got to take a step back and reconsider how you're telling a story. By the way, that's also part of leadership, is recognizing when, hey, I need to like change what I'm doing and not be afraid to admit that like maybe what I've been doing hasn't been the right thing and I need to learn from that and adjust. That doesn't mean I'm not good at what I'm doing. It means that I'm actually recognizing that I need to change course.
I really like that point, Joe, about, your ability to measure how good a job are you doing telling that story? Is it resonating? It sounds like at Wix, you're able to gauge that by stock price performance and maybe from some of the feedback from analysts, perhaps. And so I definitely want to carry that thread through to Pinterest. But just a little bit more about Wix. So I'm curious, in your investor relations role, like you're coming in as an advisor, you've had 8 years of experience at JP Morgan. Wix was one of those clients that you worked with, but then now you're working under the leadership. Did you find it to be challenging at all to influence change and try to influence your direction and guidance with leadership there? Or was it they knew that you were kind of the expert in this and like they just what you said goes kind of thing? How did that dynamic work?
Yeah, they hired me because I was the expert in this area, right? Yeah, expert in telling the story to financial audience, expert in kind of like creating a program around investor communication and education. But even with that, I don't think any executive team is just going to like immediately say, oh, everything that Joe says goes, right? You have to earn your credibility at any company. And I think any role that you're in, you're obviously hired because you're qualified. Then kind of the next phase comes where now you have to gain credibility of the CEO, the CFO, the president, whoever your audience is, and with investors, by the way. And you do that with time, you do that with kind of what I had said earlier, maybe admitting when you're not right and needing to pivot. You do that by having an opinion, going back to something I had said earlier around like not being afraid to share your view. Obviously, it needs to be well informed, but you can't be afraid to have an opinion. You can't be afraid to sit in a room with the CEO and another dozen people and disagree with the CEO in front of everybody else. And a good CEO will welcome that, And so I learned a lot about that at Wix. When you're an advisor at JP Morgan, you don't want to disagree with the CEO because they're your client, right? I mean, you can, and I'm exaggerating a bit, but like when you're in the room at a company, that's something that really is valued and should be valued. And so you have to earn that over time. And once you do, obviously that can open up other opportunities for you potentially at that company, and obviously just strengthens, your relationship with the team there.
I think that it makes a whole lot of sense, Joe, and building that credibility. I'm curious, was there an inflection point while at Wix that you like reached that point where you're like, okay, I've been here X amount of time, or I just did this and it went really well. Now I feel comfortable, taking my seat at the table and actually voicing my opinion that might not or might conflict a bit with what the CEO has been saying or with what some other leader has been saying within the company?
I don't know that there was an inflection point. I mean, I think it came over time. I think going through, every company goes through ups and downs. Every company goes through, you do it for investor relations specifically, you have an earnings report and you think it's a great report and your stock's down 10%. And you're like, what happened? Like, how did this happen? And so you're going to go through those types of things together. And so I don't know in gaining credibility with an executive team or shareholders or the board, I'm not sure I can remember an inflection point of that. I think that type of credibility just comes over time. And like I said, has to be earned over time.
That makes sense. And so towards the tail end of Wix, do you mind just talking a bit about that transition period and what led you ultimately to leave Wix and to join Pinterest?
Yeah, so I spent 10 years at Wix. It was we grew, in my time there, the company grew from 700 people to over 5,000. I think my first quarter I was there, our annual run rate revenue was 140 million. And when I left, it was 1.4 billion. So saw a tremendous amount of growth in the company, was really a key part of telling the story on the street with investors for a long period of time, which was fantastic. But I wanted to do something different. I felt like my opportunities at Wix were at an end, and I wanted to just get some new experiences to kind of add to my toolkit of leadership experiences, managerial experiences. And so that led me to Pinterest, where I have a completely different role than what I had at Wix. As I kind of said earlier, I manage real estate and workplace team, but what makes this role so different is that I actually manage a team of 52 people around the globe. I have 6 people who are direct reports to me, and it's a very different managerial and leadership experience than the role I was in at Wix, which was, I did manage a couple people, but it was more of an individual contributor role, me and kind of 2 or 3 people as a small team. That is a very different leadership role than managing a team of 50 plus people and 6 direct reports around the world. So I wanted that opportunity and that experience, and that's what led me to the role at Pinterest.
Before we get into the Pinterest piece too much further, you said just something that resonated a lot. You had tremendous success at Wix, and you helped the company grow a tremendous deal. It has to be kind of tough to walk away from that. The company's enjoying much success, and you've carried a lot of credibility within the company, and you've got a seat at the table. What was going on in your mind? What types of conversations were you having that ultimately led you to decide the time is right now to leave?
Yeah, that's a good question. You sound like my therapist a little bit. I think one of the things I've learned over my career, in some respects, I'm lucky that I've only worked at 3 companies since I graduated from Owen. But I think that one of the things I've learned in these years is that it's easy to get comfortable and it's easy to stay with what you're familiar with. And for many people, that's a great thing. And for many people, you can continue to grow in that environment. And certainly being at a company for 10 years, I made that decision for quite some time. But what ultimately, I think, pushed me over the edge, and this was a hard decision because I left a company that I had been with for so long and with people that I've built really close relationships with, is I needed to get uncomfortable again. I needed to move into something that was unfamiliar to me, that was going to be an opportunity for me to really add a skill set that I had not had before. And so that's really what what made me make that move. It was a difficult move. Changing companies is never easy. Changing roles is never easy. You have to rebuild all of that. I talked about, building and earning credibility. You have to start over again and do that again with a new team, with new people, with a new manager. And all of that's really hard, but you learn so much from doing it, and it gets you uncomfortable, which can be a good thing. And that's really what drove me to do it.
Makes a lot of sense, Joe. So let's talk about that discomfort. 8 or 9 months into Pinterest, and like you said, it's a very different role. You've been more of a individual contributor, kind of almost subject matter expert, in your prior roles, and now it's shifted quite a good deal to where you are now a people manager. You said you got 6 direct reports and 52 or so total people beneath you at Pinterest. So let's talk about some of that discomfort. Like, what were your expectations going into that, and what's reality been for you this first 8 months or so?
Yeah, I think I didn't have a lot of expectations because I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I think the biggest change for me, well, there's several big changes, but I'll start with going from a role where you're more of an individual contributor. In that role, you and maybe 2 other people or 1 other person, I had a really great partner with me at Wix who, she and I were locked in arms and doing tons of work. And we were the ones that produced the work content and presenting to the executive team and presenting to the board. Like, you're in control of the direct work product that is going out and that is, happening. When you're a manager, you give all of that up. You are no longer in control of the final kind of work product. You are now managing the people that are the ones doing all of that specific domain level work. And you may not have expertise around that domain level work. I mean, one of the teams that I manage is physical security. I know nothing about, I don't have any training in physical security. I don't have, I don't have training in protection and threat intelligence, but I manage the team that has all of that expertise. And so that's a very different role to be in. And so in this role, what I've learned is that you really have to understand how to create kind of a vision and a mission and help guide people toward that ultimate objective and goal, motivating them by setting expectations with them, by helping them. And like I said, that's just a very, very different role than being in the seat where you're the one actually putting the work product together.
But continuing on this thread that we've been pulling through each experience of telling a story, do you feel like there's still some element of telling a story, but now as a manager, something that helps to maybe motivate the people that you're working with and keep them all on the same page?
Without a doubt. I mean, this is one of the most critical, I think, skills I've learned in my entire career, is that everything you do has a story. Like, you always need to be telling a story. You always need to be delivering a message. We've presented to our CEO and CFO, about what building are we going to, what's our new office building going to look like in this city? And you'd think, well, there's no story there. You're just showing a list of options and and that couldn't be completely true. There is a story there. There is a story about where we were, where we are today, where we're going, why this one fits into that narrative. And every single kind of discipline within my team has a story to tell, and my entire team has a story to tell. And you have to be able to do that to deliver the message and get, to a decision, by whether it's a decision that the CFO is making, that you're making, that I'm making. There has to be, some type of cohesive story and message around that. And so telling that story is incredibly important no matter what you're doing.
From the way I hear it, you've had a pretty diverse set of audiences in your storytelling career, from Jake and Morgan, you're telling stories to the companies that you're working with or prospectively working with. At Wix, as the investor in investor relations, you're telling a story to investors. Now at Pinterest, you're telling a story to the leaders at Pinterest, as well as your 52-person team. Which part of that has been the easiest? What's been the hardest? Do you feel like it's all ultimately the same thing, or do you feel like it takes a different shape, depending upon the audience? How do you kind of manage that?
Yeah, so I would say that certainly in the beginning, none of it's been easy. I wouldn't characterize any of it as being easy. It obviously, as you do it more, you get more used to it. You develop kind of ways to think about how to tell the story. I kind of try to think about okay, what's the challenge? What's the problem? Why are we even sitting here today? And, you take that and you move it to, here's kind of an opportunity set. Here's kind of how we break down ways that we can solve this problem. And then, here's our solution or recommendation to solve this problem. And here's, A, B, and C, and D of why this is the best solution, and again, like you have a debate around that and maybe you come to a different conclusion. But I think that just general kind of like sequence is how I think about it usually. And then you can apply that to many, many different, every case. You could apply it to telling a story about an investment opportunity. You could tell it about a company. You could tell it about procuring a piece of real estate. You can tell it about hiring 3 people to this new team that you want to create. So you could tell it about why we need to buy this software, to manage this. So you can use that kind of like methodology to create any type of like, story and message that you need to get across and ultimately, reach a decision.
One element that I know is really important that you alluded to, especially with Wix, with like the stock price performance, was measuring how effectively are you telling that story. Do you have a method for measuring at Pinterest how effectively you're telling this story?
Well, I would say that if I have 30 minutes with my CFO to present something and I walk out of the room 30 minutes after that 30 minutes and I did not get the decision that I did not get a decision, not necessarily the one that I recommended, but like we didn't reach a conclusion, then I failed. I should be able to walk into a meeting with my CFO. One of my team members, my direct report, should be able to walk in with me. If there's a decision to be made, a request to be made, the objective of why we are here today, if that meeting ends without achieving that objective, then you have failed to tell that story in an effective way. And that happens. It definitely happens. Right? So you always learn about ways you can improve on it. But I think what I've learned over my time is like you try to go into, again, this applies to an investor meeting, a meeting with another company that you're potentially acquiring, or with a CFO, or there should be an objective and a reason why you're all sitting there, and being able to walk out of that room, having achieved that objective is kind of the measurement of success in my mind.
That makes a lot of sense, Joe. And now I'm thinking, okay, so that is the telling the story to leaders within Pinterest, the CFO. How does it change shape at all as far as like your direct reports and in trying to get them to accomplish the objectives that you've maybe worked with them to establish or establish for them? Like, is there a different way of measuring that? And how does that dynamic work?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where being a leader is so important, is that, you have to then, and this is what I think I've really been focused on at Pinterest in my time there so far, is that like really instilling that behavior on your team and leading. Again, as the manager, you're not necessarily the one who's going to be putting that presentation or memo together. You are the one guiding your leader to put that together. And so very different seat for me to be in than what I was prior to being at Pinterest. But another form of leadership is that's where I really need to like help and guide and explain what good looks like, what this should look like at the end. And they will know, and I will give them feedback, right? If we didn't achieve that goal, why? If we didn't achieve the objective, why? What can we do differently next time? Maybe I gave poor advice, maybe they didn't take my advice, or, whatever it might be, we can work it out. But I think that's really been the type of leadership that's being exhibited there.
Do you find that you've had to adapt your style or way of working, say from Wix to Pinterest, like to maybe like once you've gotten a better understanding of how your 6 direct reports work, like have you shifted more to what accommodates them? Or is it more of a, hey guys, this is what works best for me. This is what I think will make us a more effective team. I would really like it if you guys function in this manner. Or maybe both.
Yeah, it has to be both. It has to be both. Certainly, I would not like to work in an environment where my manager comes to me and says, it has to be done my way, and I don't really care about your way, and this is how it's going to be done. I'm sure that happens. I'm not, and by the way, there are cases where that does have to happen. Right? But I think as a manager, if again, a lot of the role is to lead your team through a challenge, a problem, a goal, a mission, right? And so and if you are going to be that leader, you have got to adjust yourself to their with limits, because some of what they might be doing won't work. You know that, but you have to learn to adapt your approach to what works best for them. Everyone's different, and you can have overarching kind of methods that you want to make sure people focus on, like making sure we're telling a story, making sure we're using data, all of those things. You can say, we will do these things. But then for each individual manager, you've got to adjust your approach and say, okay, here's how in your domain and with you as a who you are. Like, here's how we'll kind of, what I think is the best way to move forward with this presentation or this type of approach that we're having. So it's got to be both, I think, to be an effective leader.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, the question that's now circling my mind is like, how do you do that while still being authentic to yourself and what works best for you?
Yeah, well, I think it's being a good leader, I think, is one where you have to adapt and you have to also admit when you might be wrong. You have to recognize when maybe your method isn't the right method. And so I think part of that is just being a humble, leader in many cases. And it's I would say it absolutely is one of the more challenging aspects of it that I've experienced so far.
How have you found the whole process of giving feedback? Has that gotten easier within the 8 months that you've been there? Or are you still like so early in that it's still like a difficult point? Or was that something that's just been kind of straightforward from the get-go for you?
Yeah, look, I think giving feedback is one of the hardest things to do as a manager. I think you have to like begin, in my opinion, like when you're managing someone, you have to start with caring about that person, like personally, being empathetic. Like, again, everyone shows up with something different, right? Everyone shows up in a different way. Everyone has their own story, right? And so like I think, first of all, have to care about that person and show that person that you care about them and show them that like you as their leader want to see them succeed and you want them to do great things, right? And so the only way to do that is to like show them that you care about them as a person and them as a leader, and you care about what they're doing. That takes time, right? That doesn't happen on day one. You have to build a relationship. And I think only then can you then have a really hard conversation. If you have to have a hard conversation, have to have a hard conversation about something they need to do differently or something they're not doing well. And if you have that really good relationship, then you can have that conversation. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it's not going to be as uncomfortable if there's already like a strain in the relationship where there's not a mutual respect for one another. There's not a personal connection there in some way. So I think to answer your question, like feedback, it has gotten easier, partly because I'm building relationships with people, partly because the more I do it, the better you get at it. But it's never easy. It's never comfortable to tell someone, hey, you're not doing well here. You need to do differently. You need to do better. But I think it has to be done, and I think that's one of the hardest aspects of being a leader.
I can only imagine, Joe. And I'm curious, like, are there people that you have been able to lean on, maybe mentors or people within Pinterest or people in your personal life or resources as far as like how to navigate this process of having to give feedback? What does that kind of feedback loop look like for you?
Yeah, a lot of people. All of those things. I mean, I think throughout my career, I've created really good relationships with my managers, with coworkers, gotten advice from them, have gotten feedback myself. So on the other end of that feedback and knowing how that looks when the feedback's coming to you, a lot of what you can kind of learn from about being a manager is like, think about who were good managers for you, who was a good manager for you, who was not a good manager for you. And then use those to adapt how you're going to then manage people. And then, yes, absolutely, have looked at books. I have an HR business partner here at Pinterest. She's amazing. She doubles as my therapist. And, so much of what you deal with as a manager is dealing with people, obviously. And so like that just comes with a lot to talk about and a lot to manage through. And so she's been someone that I can turn to and bounce ideas off of and get direction on. And then there's an endless amount of books and podcasts that I still consume and listen to this day.
Always learning, right? That growth mindset.
Yeah, you have to, because you're always going to be encountering new situations in different situations.
Cool. Well, I'm going to close it out, Joe, with just this one final question that we have tried to ask all of our podcast guests. And that's just the simple, what advice would you offer to both current and prospective students at Owen?
Yeah, I think it's cliched, but you have to like the people you work with. You have to like who you're going to be with all the time. I mean, when you go work somewhere, when you go to school somewhere, you're going to be with those people more than your family, most likely. And so, you better like them. And then I'm not just saying you like them like it's fun to have a meal with them. I mean, like, you have to like respect that they are someone that has, the same values that you do, that share what's important in life and are fun people to be with too. And so I would say that, like, for me, I've only had 3 roles in my years since I graduated Owen because I've liked the people so much in every one that I've stayed for quite some time in every one of them. And that's just because of the people. So I would say that is the number one piece of advice that I would give.
I think that resonates a whole lot with me. It'll resonate a whole lot with listeners for this show. And I do have just a follow-up question, Joe. I'm curious, like, having spent 10 years at Wix, and obviously that's a huge testament to how well you did get along with the folks there. To what extent were you able to do like due diligence up front with Pinterest to determine, hey, this is going to be the right fit for me, and I know I'm leaving something really good behind for this new opportunity. Like, how are you able to get comfortable with that transition before actually joining?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the role of Pinterest was referred to me by someone I met in my time at Wix. It wasn't a person who worked at Wix. It was actually one of our investors, but developed a relationship with him over many years. He and I connected, both, had, obviously investor meetings, but also outside of investor meetings, got to know one another. So there was a good connection there, kind of like, again, really strong shared values. And he referred me to Pinterest and the team there who he was very close to. And so I kind of, that was like, you're never going to be able to fully diligence and vet your team, right? I mean, and I'm certainly not suggesting that that's ever possible, but like that kind of, introduction and knowledge that like who's someone who I really kind of, would admire and share the same values, sees the same things in this company. So that's like a check, like, okay, this is a good place to be. These are good people. And then you have to make a decision. You're not always going to know right away. And so I would say, if you do step into a situation where you don't like the people you're working with, then you need to figure out a way to leave and go do something else, because you can never fully vet it. But that initial check was certainly something that kind of was a big clearance for me.
Yeah, no, that's great insight, Joe. I appreciate that. And honestly, just really appreciate your time. Congrats on all of your success, and we'll be here rooting for you from the Owen community. So thanks again, Joe.
Yeah, great podcast series that you guys have started. Congratulations on that, and good luck to you and your time at Owen.
Thank you so much.
All right, everybody, take care.